Hello, and welcome to Political Science 102, Introduction to American Government and Politics. I'm Dr. Dino Bozonelos, and I will be lecturing on Chapter 8 in the Maroney and Kirsch's book, By the People, Debating American Government, entitled Public Opinion. Please make sure that when you're listening to this lecture that you also have the PowerPoint for Chapter 8 available to follow along. I will frequently be referencing the PowerPoints as the semester progresses, especially when it comes to graphs. You can either print out the PowerPoints, or for those of you that have Windows 7 and above, have a split screen with the PowerPoint available. It is my advice that you have the printed PowerPoints with notes from the lecture and the book on the PowerPoints before you take the quizzes. Many times students fare poorly on the quizzes as they're frantically looking for the answers without having read the book, or try to answer the question simultaneously without watching the video. As the questions are randomized, this strategy won't work. So let's begin. This is Chapter 8 in the book, and we're looking at public opinion. And so in this chapter, what will happen is students will explore the sources of our opinions about public issues. In other words, where do we get our ideas about the opinions that we have? We'll reflect upon the role of public opinion in a democracy, because if a democracy is about what the people want, then it's really good to understand what the people are thinking. That can tell us what they want. And finally, we look at understand the uses of public opinion in politics and government. Now we understand what the people want. How does that actually translate into policy? So what I do here is I add a little bit, I think the authors kind of jump into the sources of public opinion right away, and I don't think they give enough about public opinion in terms of the concept itself. So what I put here is I put in this slide that I actually define public opinion. And public opinion is what we say is the aggregation or the collection or the coming together of people's views about issues, situations, and public figures. In other words, everyone has an individual opinion. We bring it together, we aggregate it, and then that produces an overall public opinion. So individual opinions then are transformed into a public opinion by synthesizing them together. Now, I would argue that public opinion is obviously an essential element for democracy. Again, the government wants to know what you're thinking, so then they can make better decisions. Now, for those of you that are cynical out there, you may not agree, but ultimately, every president, every congressperson kind of wants to know what's going on. They're not interested in always going against the public. There are times when they do, and we'll talk about that. So we argue that there are those opinions held by private persons which governments find prudent to heed. Why? Because frankly, you vote. If you vote in elected officials, then they care about what you're saying. We'll talk about that in other chapters. When you don't vote as much, then it becomes public opinion and democracy become less connected. Hence why voting is so important. Now, it need not be actively expressed. What I mean by this is that there's kind of a law of anticipated reactions. In some cases, what happens is public opinion can influence government, and it can do so indirectly and passively. In other words, a president may say, should I float this policy? Is this something I want to come up with? And he or she as president may say, you know what? I don't think the public's going to react well to this. Or you know what? I think the public will really like this. It could range from anything from foreign policy to domestic policy, to fiscal policy. In other words, all different types of policies. Presidents and members of Congress or governors, they're always thinking about how will the public react to this. So it's anticipated. So it's kind of this law of anticipated reactions that we're talking about. So for example, how does public opinion actually look like? Here's a graph that is taken from the book, and it looks at U.S. public support and opposition to gay marriage. And I want you to notice something here. From about 2001 to about 2011, the majority of Americans who were surveyed showed, from the Pew Research Center, showed that they were opposed to allowing gay and lesbians to marry legally, whereas those that favored were in the minority. That shifted in about 2010, 2011, where now by 2014, the majority favor allowing gays and lesbians to marry legally. So you ask, how then does public opinion affect democracy? Look at the Supreme Court decision from 2015. In that Supreme Court decision, they struck down state laws that banned marriage or defined marriage as only between a man and a woman. Now, interestingly enough, states have been shifting away from that and allowing for marriage to be defined differently, in this case between a man and man or a woman and a woman. And that's a trend that had been happening, plus public opinion. Then the Supreme Court felt that it was the right time to do so. Interestingly enough, a very similar case had occurred earlier, about 5 years ago, and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and them decided to not address the case. They basically said, we choose not to address it. We'll get to that in another chapter, how that works. And they said that the time is not right. So your public opinion actually does matter. It influences how politicians, including judges, how they think about things. You know, so when we don't have an opinion on an issue, it's usually because we don't know, or we're afraid because it's a very complicated issue, or we're worried we might hurt somebody. And ultimately, it's about just how we express our opinion. We can do this in ways that we have civility with controversy. In other words, we can talk about controversial things, but still be civil about it. I think we often think that because it's controversial that we cannot be civil, and I actually really disagree with that. I think we can be civil. Now let's look at this next graph. You do see that some of the reason maybe why you're seeing a shift over the 10 years is simply generational. That, you know, those who were born between 1928 and 1945, the silent generation, they're the most opposed to gay marriage. And then the baby boomers are less opposed. Generation X is less opposed, which is my generation. And then the millennials, which is most likely your generation, is the least opposed. In fact, they are in favor of, they're the most in favor of same-sex marriage. Now, honestly speaking, what's happening in 10 years is more folks from the silent generation are simply either not voting or they're passing on, they're dying. And what's happening here is that if you see a shift generationally, then over time we see a shift in favor of this. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. So our public opinions, you know, do matter because it allows us to kind of understand, allows government to understand what we, the American people, want. And so I tend to argue with folks who say, oh, well, the government's not responsive to us. Well, actually, the government is responsive in many ways. Sometimes they're a little too responsive, and we'll get to that, but they are quite responsive. And when you look at the surveys and then you look at their reactions, you see that there is response. It just depends on which survey they want to look at and, you know, which way it's trending. Sometimes if they go against those surveys, they can get in a lot of trouble. An example will be, and then I'll move on, is, you know, at the end of President Bush's term, the Iraq War had become very unpopular. All the surveys show that the American people had wanted to finish the war in Iraq and move on, but President Bush kept arguing, no, we're going to stay the course, we're going to stay the course. Why do I bring that up? Because it made him even more unpopular, which then didn't allow him to do other things. Because of that unpopularity, he was unable to complete other projects. And so it does affect. And so presidents and congressmen don't always want to go against what the people say. Sometimes they do. But if they do, it's because they have strong convictions about things. And sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. Lyndon Johnson put forth the Civil Rights Act, even though a good majority of Americans may have not wanted it. He said, no, this is the right thing to do. And he ended up being right. However, he had the same feelings towards the Vietnam War, and he said the American people are against it, but I don't care, I'm going to keep pursuing it. He ended up being wrong. We didn't do well in that war. So, you know, there is a time and a place, and honestly, when is the right time to listen to public opinion, when is not, I don't know. I don't think anybody does. I think that's why presidents make decisions. That's what they're elected to do. All right, so let's look at then where our sources of public opinion come from. It's important. Let's take a look at some classic sources that we have in regards to this. The first one we talk about is just economic self-interest. In other words, we vote our pocketbook. That's what we often say about this. And we have a basic assumption in this economic self-interest source, is that we all will try to increase our wealth. Therefore, those who are wealthier, we argue, should probably vote for lower taxes. And so that's a common assumption that we have. Wealthier people are going to want to vote for candidates that are looking to lower taxes, primarily because they'll benefit pocketbook-wise. And this comes from this assumption that all will try to increase wealth. Now, that's mostly true, but not always true. And I'll give you some examples. before we get there. Wealthier people, on average, tend to vote Republican. Republicans tend to push more in terms of tax cuts, especially for small businesses and medium-sized businesses, which were a lot of people that have individual wealth. That's where they get their wealth from. Small businesses are the drivers of individual wealth. People who develop something, have a product or a service, or work really hard, they're the ones who develop it. It's rare to become wealthy working a standard job. You could make money, but not necessarily have real wealth. And poor Americans tend to vote for Democrats. Poor Democrats tend to favor spending on social programs that often provide the benefits that poor Americans are missing. This could be access to preschool, access to health care, access to a whole range of issues that upper middle class and wealthy Americans have that lower middle class and poor Americans don't. But again, as I mentioned, it's not always the case. So for example, there are people who live in New York City and San Francisco that identify as very liberal, and they are all in favor of raising taxes. In fact, one of the most wealthiest people in this country, Warren Buffett, has said that it is not right that he pays a lower tax rate than his secretary. And they've often referred to this now as the Buffett tax, that they want to raise taxes on the ultra wealthy because some of the ultra wealthy are saying you should. You also have from Microsoft, I can't remember right now. Sorry, I'm trying to drink some coffee and remember this. But you have several ultra wealthy people saying no, we should be paying more taxes. So that's not always the case. And if you see in New York and San Francisco and other very liberal cities, you have very wealthy people who are saying, yeah, we don't mind paying more taxes. The opposite is true as well. So you'll see here that I have an image called What's the Matter with Kansas by Thomas Frank. Interestingly, that book talks about how poor conservatives keep voting in politicians that keep cutting social spending and cutting taxes. Now, the current governor of Kansas is Sam Brownback, and he was elected in 2010 on that platform, essentially saying that I'm going to lower taxes and cut government spending, reduce the footprint of the government. What that'll do is that'll stimulate business, reduce regulations, what have not. Come to find out that that actually hasn't worked. And reason being is because not all states are the same. Cutting taxes may work in one state, but it doesn't work in another state, because just paying less taxes is the only thing businesses care about. They also care about a customer base. They also care about transporting the particular product or providing the service. It's more than just reducing taxes. Businesses, if they have access to services, may not mind paying taxes. It really depends on the state. Some states are okay with this, some states aren't. So for example, Massachusetts had universal health care that was funded by the state. It actually took the healthcare burden off some of the businesses there. So they were in favor of it. So yeah, they paid a little bit more taxes here, but they were able to reduce costs in other areas. Whereas in Kansas, what's happening is you have conservatives who are probably lower middle class to poor, who could benefit from social programs, but because they strongly believe in cutting taxes, they have voted in politicians who are cutting taxes, and therefore, because they're cutting taxes, cutting spending. And it's had a real effect in Kansas. I strongly urge you to pick up this book and look at articles about Kansas. They are struggling mightily because there's not enough money to fund public education, not enough money to fund transportation, because they've cut taxes. And again, the idea behind cutting taxes is that you cut taxes, businesses grow, and the tax base grows. And as the tax base grows, then you have more money. And in philosophy, it sounds pretty good. And in some cases, it actually has worked. It just really depends on if you have options. It really worked in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, because wealthy Americans, when they got their taxes cut, they just reinvested. Well, in Kansas, if you're a wealthy Kansan and you have your taxes cut, you might actually invest outside of Kansas. You may not invest inside of Kansas. And also, if you're a corporation, you may not move to Texas simply to save money, because there's a whole host of other factors that go into this. For example, I have colleagues of mine that work for a company that relocated from Irvine to Utah, and they relocated mostly for tax purposes to Utah. And the folks who are running this company said, look how much we're saving in regards to taxes. Well, their workforce, because they produce a synthetic material that go inside a heart during a heart transplant, the workforce didn't want to leave. The workforce said, we're not leaving Orange County. So they stayed there, and what ended up happening is they had to hire a new workforce, and their product is inferior. So now they're shipping a lot of their work back to Orange County. And now they're thinking about just uprooting the entire company and bringing it back to Orange County. So in some cases, lower taxes can really help In other cases, it can't. Every business is different. So I'm just trying to put this in perspective so people can understand that there's no real right answer. If you say, oh, cutting taxes is the real answer to everything, the answer is no. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It depends on the situation. Increasing spending will help us dramatically. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes when the government increases spending, it helps. Sometimes it does not help at all. So it really varies. There's no magic bullet, and I think a lot of times you get stuck on the magic bullets because they're just easier to understand rather than the reality is much more complex. All right, so what's another source of public opinion is simple demography. Race, gender, age, religion, where someone lives. These are all really, really strong, predictors of political attitudes. For example, I want to show you this graph here. I grabbed it from another book. But this one essentially says that, one of these, if you look here in the middle, it says that whites have more confidence in police forces than, let's say, blacks or Latinos. And in fact, I think let me see if I can grab this thing here and just circle this one right here in the middle. Oops, I'm going to try right here. Police have high honesty and ethical standards. And whites say about 50%, where, black Americans say around 30%. And so you see here that there are differences in terms of race. There are differences in terms of gender. Women tend to vote more Democrat than Republican. And if you ask why, primarily because, again, Democrats tend to prefer social programs that spend. What you often see is a disproportionate number of people who are poor single mothers. So single mothers tend to benefit more from programs than, let's say, single fathers, because single mothers are often the ones raising the children. So they benefit more, so they're less likely to want to see these programs disappear. You also see, for example, that it can sort of allow us to enable predictions about voting. And so I believe in the next graph here we go. If you see U.S. public support for marijuana legalization, you see that there is a real difference in terms of age. And so we can predict how votes are going to go. If we had a vote in California in 2012 on whether or not to legalize marijuana, it failed. If we were to have a vote again, many people are arguing that it would pass, primarily because now more younger people are voting, and if more younger people are voting, then it's more likely to pass. Why do we think it's more likely to pass? Look at the number here. 69% of millennials here that are born between 1981 and 1988 favor the legalization of marijuana, whereas in my generation it's 53%. Baby boomers, which is my dad's generation, 52%, and then the silent generation, to my grandparents' generation, is only 30%. So, you see changes, in regards to age as well. So strong predictors of opinion. Here's another one that we have here, another predictor of voting, political participation. There's a voting gap, and this is percent voting for a Democratic candidate. And what you often see is that from around 2000 to about 2012, consistently 18 to 29-year-olds are voting Democrat. Whereas if you're older, they're less likely to vote Democrat. In fact, they were really low under Nixon. They've gone up a little bit through the years, but they've stayed consistent. And really, it's the youth that have really driven a lot of the voting. So Obama captured a high percentage of the youth vote. And the thing is, the youth, if they vote, they can make a difference. They often don't vote. Their participation rates are very low, and we talked about that a little bit last chapter. But there is a gap here. So this is good predictors. So what do we mean by this? Is that if you're Mitt Romney and you know that young people are trending Democrat and you know that you need the Republican vote, you're going to really target older Americans. And you're really going to push for older Americans to vote for you. And so that's where you decide where you spend your money, where your commercials are, the phone calls that you make. All the money that these folks raise is so that they can reach out to you and get to vote. Because no matter how much money they raise, if they don't reach out properly, then they're not going to get elected. And that's one thing we learned with Mitt Romney, is that if you don't turn out the vote, and I may show you this in a future chapter, Mitt Romney earned 7 million votes less than John McCain. If Mitt Romney just had the same turnout as John McCain, he would have won the election. So he didn't turn out the same amount of people for whatever reason, and And because of this, he lost the election to Barack Obama. So turnout really matters in how many people come out to vote. And that's a big debate, is how do you get these folks to come out to vote? The Obama campaign really used a lot of social media. It was very historic, obviously the first African-American running. You can't discount that. It really captured people's attention. And so, it really made a difference in terms of young Americans. All right. Party preference is also a strong predictor of opinions. It's probably even a stronger opinion than race and or religion. Because what happens is if you register as a Democrat or Republican, you're pretty much likely to stay committed to that party. If you're not really sure, you'll probably register as an independent when you register to vote. But if you are registered Democrat or Republican, switching doesn't happen often. It does, but it usually takes a long time for somebody to switch their party ID. And what a party ID is, we often use a word in psychology called a heuristic. A heuristic is a mental shortcut. In other words, if you're a Republican and the Republican Party says we're for this, you tend to be for it. If the Republican Party says we're against this, you tend to be against it. Same thing with Democrats. If you identify as a Democrat, Democratic Party says we're against the Keystone XL pipeline, then you're against it. If Republicans say we're for it, then you're for it. Why is this? Is that we don't think on our own? No, we do think on our own. What we've noticed is that these mental shortcuts allow us to think quickly. We have an idea of what we want, but when we agree, if we agree with what most of the Republican Party says, if we agree with what most of the Democratic Party says, then it's likely we'll agree with them on this Keystone XL pipeline as well. So therefore, we agree with them. So you see this. It may be once you get a little bit more information and it's more nuanced that you may start changing your mind. But even then, it's unlikely. Psychology tells us that that's unlikely to happen. The interesting thing is that differences have really grown between the parties. In other words, the parties have really what we become polarized. They've really separated in terms of how they look at different issues. So it used to be that there was a lot of common ground between Republicans and Democrats, and since the election of Barack Obama and the rise of the Tea Party in response to his election, there's been a lot less compromise and a lot more polarization. Now, if you look at this from 1987 to 2012, you can see this polarization. You can see here that party is probably a better predictor of how you vote rather than race, education, income, religiosity, and or gender. And notice that race and education have probably been the top two for the longest time. Party now matters, and that's interesting because the party then can help sort of determine which way we're going. The Republican Party has been struggling a little bit with the Democratic Party. Normally, the Democratic Party is a big tent party, or they have a lot more diversity in their opinion. That's kind of been the case all the way up until about the 2000s. Now the Democratic Party have really united on certain issues, whereas a lot of the really good debates and really good conversations are now happening on the Republican side. Republicans have really strong disagreements among themselves, which used to be how the Democrats used to act in the 80s and 90s. Now the roles have reversed, and this will keep on happening. In 20, 30 years from now, Democrats may have really hardcore conversations with themselves, while Republicans are all united on issues. This happens. Parties go back and forth in this respect. The other way to understand your source of public opinion is through elite influence. What we mean by elites is often we talk about political elites. People look to political elites on issues. Political elites are individuals who control significant wealth, status, power, or visibility, and can have significant influence over public debates. So political elites are folks who have comments about politics, and it could be because they have a celebrity status that makes them visible. They could have certain amounts of power derived from wealth or status. Or they could actually be in a political office. You don't always have to be wealthy to be in a political office. President Obama had student loans going into the presidency. He was nowhere near as wealthy as Romney. Nowhere near. McCain's not. He's wealthy now, but he wasn't born into wealth. John Kerry married into wealth as well. Bill Clinton was probably the poorest president, if you want to think about it. Jimmy Carter was, a peanut farmer. He didn't have the kind of money that we're thinking about. Reagan wasn't wealthy either. So a lot of these presidents, believe it or not, are not as wealthy as we think. Wealthy people don't tend to make it to the presidency. Kind of interesting. The Bushes are probably the exception. They were pretty wealthy. The Bushes came from about 6 generations of wealth. So But that's not, you're seeing here that that's not always the case. Richard Nixon was extremely poor. If you go to his presidential library in Yorba Linda, you'll see the house he was born in. It's a little shack. So interesting how that works. Now, we also look to figures who have the most credibility and have the greatest influence. What we mean by credibility? Credibility could be some kind of expert maybe. We turn to an expert, or we turn to somebody who has published a lot, or somebody who has spoken a lot. They have a lot of credibility on the issue, and so we trust their opinion. Now, elites then compete with each other to sort of shape views on issues. And so, elites will, say, hey, we agree with Common Core, we do not agree with Common Core. And then these elites who disagree about Common Core, which is the educational, the way of teaching education in K through 12 that has now been adopted by 45 states, they disagree on whether or not Common Core should be accepted, how it should be tested. All these elites are competing, and parents who are concerned about their children's education are looking to these different comments by these elites to help shape their opinion about Common Core. Now, obviously, one of the most important political elites that we have is that of the president. And as I mentioned earlier with George Bush, unpopular presidents have less influence on public opinion. George Bush was very unpopular. I'll show you that when we get to another chapter. Because of his unpopularity, he was unable to shape public opinion on other issues. And so President Obama, I want to show you here this graph. This is a graph from the Pew Research Center. And, the darker brown line is approved. The yellow line is disapproved. And what you're seeing here is that earlier in his administration, when he had a lot more support, he got a lot more things done. He passed about 6 different comprehensive laws, one of them being the Affordable Care Act, the Frank Dodd, Finance Reform Act, whole range of acts. There was a huge stimulus package in February 9, 2009. But notice, as his disapproval rating has gone up, it's making it harder and harder for him to things get done. In fact, now he's going to focus in areas that he has more control over, for example, like foreign affairs, than, let's say, domestic affairs, because he has to share those powers with Congress. So, look, unpopular presidents, and I would argue that, President Obama has dropped in popularity, but he's nowhere near as unpopular as previous presidents. He's actually pretty par for the course when it comes to favorability ratings. A lot of presidents start off, strong in their 50s and 60s, and then kind of go into their 40s and 30s by the time they're done. It's pretty normal. So Obama's trajectory is pretty normal. There are a couple exceptions. President Bush started around 50, spiked to 91, and then came all the way down to about 22, which is a big drop. Bill Clinton, interestingly, started off low. He started off at like 43. He actually ended around 60. So very interesting that President Clinton actually ended more popular than where he started, which is normally not the case. So again, this is kind of a rule of thumb. It's not a hardcore law or anything in regards to that aspect. All right, so wars and other focusing events, what they can do is they can also influence our public opinion. Tragedies, terrorist attacks, starts of wars. What they do is they produce consensus, and they spike in government approval ratings. And while the book doesn't mention this, I call it the rally around the flag effect. And this is definitely what happened post 9/11. We spiked to 91% approval rating for President Bush. So that means that overwhelming majority of Democrats and Republicans supported President Bush. Why is that important? Because remember, he was in a very contentious and disputed election with Al Gore, which kind of split the country in half in 2000. But in 2001, with the terrorist attacks, we rallied around President Bush. It helped that President Bush actually gave really good speeches too. People often malign or really go after President Bush for giving bad speeches. And if you look towards the end of his presidency, his speeches were pretty bad. But you got to look at his speeches around 9/11, and they really were well crafted, well thought out. People really believed in President Bush, and we followed him in regards to Afghanistan and Iraq. So that's that rally around the flag effect. But look, opinions do change over time. As I mentioned, we supported President Bush with the Iraq War. And then when he said we needed to invade Iraq to go get weapons of mass destruction that President Saddam Hussein could give to terrorists, when we found out that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and he admitted that in 2004, support for the Iraq War plummeted. I mean, to the point where it almost reversed itself from 70 in favor to 30 against to 70 against and 30 in favor. So you see, the shift. Now you also see shifts in, for example, like bombings against ISIS. We have this, in 2000, by the time we left Iraq, support for involvement in Iraq had dropped to about, I said, about 30%. By about 2014, many Americans have now shifted. In 2015, Americans are now shifting to saying maybe we need to get back involved in Iraq on a limited basis. In other words, because of ISIS, a terrorist organization that exists in both Iraq and Syria, you're starting to see a public opinion shift and maybe having more involvement because of what Americans are seeing. This last graph I'll show you is that from Deepwater Horizon. Look at this. Opinions change over time. So this is the percent of people who disapproved offshore drilling. It's only about 22% before the Deepwater Horizon oil rig that blew up in Mexico and sent, millions of gallons of oil gushing into the Gulf of Mexico. Then you see here after the rig explosion that 50% of Americans opposed it. And then months after the rig exploded, you see that those who disapproved it dropped to 40%. So once the focus had been off the offshore, or the rig explosion and the millions of gallons, and the media had shifted to other issues, you see those who disapprove of offshore drilling, the percentage dropping. Just to give you an idea of how this works. All right. So one of the things I want to mention here is sort of participation in political surveys. There's a couple of things I want you to notice when we're doing these, because what we often do is when we measure public opinion, we use surveys. That's the number one way that we measure public opinion. That's how we know how people are thinking. And so if you look here, there's three ways of understanding with surveys: are contact rate, cooperation rate, and response rate. It's on page 267, the blue page that's in your book. And if you look at the contact rate, percent of households in which an adult was reached, you see in the 90s we reached a lot more people than we did have in 2012. If you're asking me, Professor, why is that? Simple. Cell phones and the internet. In other words, today's world, everyone has a cell phone. It's a lot more expensive to contact a cell phone than it is a landline. And most people don't have landlines anymore. And if they even have, and in fact, a lot of us we may still have cell phones, but we're moving more and more towards voice over internet protocol, where a lot of people are communicating by using, some kind of a messenger, like through Facebook or Skype or Instagram, or in other words, we're even moving away from cell phones as a way to communicate. We're using the cell phone to communicate, but we're not actually talking on the cell phone per se. So cooperation rate is those that contacted that yielded an interview. So you notice that the number of people who are, that yielded an interview is dropping. And then the response rate is the percent of households that sampled that yielded an interview. So not all people that are willing to interview fit our sample, and so notice it's getting harder and harder. So one of the problems that we have with surveying public opinion is the contact rates are down, our cooperation rate's down, and the response rate has dropped dramatically as well. So it's getting harder to survey the American people to find out what's going on, which again is important. Public opinion is the essential element for democracy. Without knowing what the public wants, and we really don't have the word democratia, demos meaning people, kratia meaning to rule. If we're ruling by the people, then we need to know what the people are thinking. That's just plain and simple. All right. So when we are trying to measure public opinion, often what you see is that professional polling firms are like Gallup, media outlets, partisan outlets, academic research sessions. They all try to keep the most up-to-date polls. And look, good polling techniques are important. And reliable polls need to be carefully designed to make sure that they are scientific. And so this means that politicians have to be careful about what we call their sampling frame. Their sampling frame is a designated group of people from whom a set of poll respondents is randomly selected. And so you just can't interview anybody. You actually have to make sure that your sampling frame, and a sample is simply a it's a section of the larger group. So if you have 300 million people in the United States, you're not going to survey all 300 million people. Instead, you're going to survey a sample, or just taking little parts from here and there. So you might survey 3,000 people and not 300 million people. But that actually works. It's okay as long as the sampling frame is representative of the population itself. So if the sample that I have is not representative of the population I'm trying to poll, then it's going to be a bad sample. And that means the results that they provide us are not accurate of what the public is thinking. So this does happen. For example, one of the most notorious blunders was in 1936. And I have this little thing here that I can, I don't have to read it to you, but I can sort of explain it to you. What happened is in 1936, FDR had running for a second term in the middle of the Great Depression. He was running against a candidate, and a Republican candidate, Alf London, and the Literary Digest had sent out a voter card and said, look, a survey, and said, look, fill out the survey, send it back to us, and that will help us determine whether or not who's going to win the election. Well, they sent it out to 10 million Americans, and they thought, gee, that'll give us a big enough sample. Look at this. 10 million Americans is a huge sample. We'll tally up all this vote, and then it'll tell us we're going to predict who's going to win the election in 1936. Well, the mistake that they made is that they drew their recipients from telephone books and automobile registration lists, but at that time in the 1930s represented the affluent who are more likely to vote Republican. And so it backfired because the Democrat, Roosevelt, he won in a landslide. He won every state except two. I mean, it was one of the most lopsided elections in American history. So what the heck did the Literary Digest do wrong? Is that their sampling frame was bad. They only sampled people from particular lists. Well, those lists were biased in favor of people who could afford a phone at that time, 1936, and who could afford an automobile, which means you had to have some money to afford it. When 1 out of every 4 Americans was out of work and 1 out of every 80 Americans didn't have enough to eat, they didn't care about having access to a phone or a car. So their sampling frame was wrong. It was not representative of the population. So what does this mean then? Good polls must reflect the population that you're trying to research. And there has to be variation. And so, example, if we're trying to research what the American people think, there has to be variation in age, education, income, race, ethnic group, gender, many other factors that go into this. We can't just all survey people from New York City. We're going to have to make sure that our sampling frame includes people from all around the United States. And so good surveys then include demographic groups in rough proportion to their presence in a city's population. And the demographic group, what we mean by that is a group of people that are sharing specific factors, such as age, ethnicity, race, religion, or country of origin. And understand this is extremely important. So, if you go out and just survey people in your neighborhood, you'll have a survey of just people in your neighborhood, and you don't know if that's actually what the neighborhood thinks. Either you have to survey everybody in the neighborhood, or you take a representative sample of people in that neighborhood, which means you got to do your research, and you got to know who lives in that neighborhood and who doesn't, and then from there randomly pick. That's the other part here, is you have to have randomly picking people. You just can't say, well, my neighborhood's 12% black, therefore I'm going to make sure my sample's 12% black, because there's got to be variation among black that have education, black that don't have education, single, not married, children, no children. You got to have variation in that aspect. And then also too, you have to have a randomization. So if you're going to survey your neighborhood and 12% of your neighborhood's black, which means 12% of your sample must be black, then you can't just say, I'm going to pick my neighbor and then his 3 friends. It's got to be randomly selected, so that way the opinions aren't bunched up. So it's really difficult. Surveys, scientific surveys, doing things right are really, really difficult. And a lot of times what happens is Americans say, well, I just don't I don't trust the fact that when you sample a group of people that, let's say we're trying to understand what 300 million Americans think, and we only sample 3,000 Americans. Many people say, I just don't buy that. Well, mathematics actually shows it to be true. We have what's called the central limit theorem, which is based on the quadratic formula, for those of you who remember that from high school. And the central limit theorem suggests that the mean of the sample can be approximate to the mean of the population most of the time. And we'll talk about that. That most of the time, that error term in statistics is actually recorded as the margin of error. So it does actually, mathematics does show, as long as your sampling frame is representative. If your sampling frame is not representative of the population trying to research, then the margin of error will be huge. You'll see that it won't line up mathematically. So another thing to consider when putting in a survey is, do you want, depending on the question that you're asking, is all residents or just likely voters? Sometimes when we're asking, who you're going to vote for or how you think about this, sometimes we only want to ask people who are likely to vote. Sometimes we're not interested in asking the whole population's opinion because not everybody's interested. So likely voters are included when poll respondents are identified as more probable to turn out in an upcoming election. And again, these folks are preferred by polling organizations, but they're difficult to specify with great accuracy. In other words, it's harder to get to these folks because there's just, they're less of the population. All right, other items to consider when doing surveys is the timing of the survey, whether it's during the day or during the night. For example, polls that are conducted on the day of the election are much more accurate than polls conducted weeks before the election. Maybe calling in the evening when people are home rather than at work during the day. There's also what we call framing effects. The way that the questions are asked are also important. The phrasing should always consider, how am I framing this question? Can it lead a respondent a certain way? Can we influence the respondent depending on how the polling question is asked? And yes, changing in wording can significantly alter many, many people's answers. So let me take you a look here. If you look at this graph here, it says attitudes towards government spending, on programs for low-income families by program description 2010. And when the question was asked talking about assistance to the poor, Americans said we spend too little, by 67%. But when we changed it to saying welfare, about 34% said about right, and 41% said too much. So what's the difference between welfare and assistance to the poor? Not much. Welfare is assistance to the poor. It's just that welfare carries a negative connotation. When we say welfare, we have all these images in our mind of what it means. Derogatorily, we often think of a welfare queen. Martin Gillens wrote a book called Why Americans Hate Welfare, and it's often because we have this image of who's accepting welfare. And so that image is what makes us turned off by that word. Whereas if we say assistance to the poor, we have a totally different type of image in our mind. And because of that, Martin Gillens says, we're more likely to say, yes, I want to help poor people, but no, I don't want to give welfare. But if you think about it, there really isn't any difference between welfare and assistance to the poor. This is why the way a question asked can really influence the response. So what surveyors have to do is take that into account. They have to make sure that questions are not leading, questions are not confusing. And many times, organizations will then vary how the questions are asked. Or what they'll do is they'll randomly reorder the question. So that way what happens is sometimes when you ask one question, it can lead to another question, they follow, and you don't want to do that. You want to randomize it. So it minimizes the influence of any one wording. Other times what happens is some folks, what they do is they just use what we call push polls. Push polls are a form of negative campaigning that masquerades as a regular opinion survey. It's usually conducted by a campaign or allied groups, and they feature strongly critical or unflattering information, about an opponent. And push polls are notorious. They've become more and more prevalent as time goes on. One of the more notorious push polls that was used in the 2000 Republican presidential primary between George W. Bush and John McCain. It was in South Carolina, and an anonymous political operative at the time, which ended up being, John McCain argued, ended up being, he was a member of the Bush campaign, though the Bush campaign still denies it, is they asked hundreds of South Carolina voters, would you be more likely or less likely to vote for John McCain for president if you knew he had fathered an illegitimate black child? So this is a really, really, this question this is a strong question. And this is a negative question, basically saying he had fathered an illegitimate child and this child was black. They're picking on the fact that John McCain and his wife had adopted a daughter from Bangladesh back in 1992. Cindy McCain had adopted had gone to Bangladesh for charity work and adopted a young Bangladeshi girl that they've raised as part of their family, and she is still part of their family. But they used that as a rumor to try and say that John McCain is not somebody that you want as president. And so it was really damning, this question. And John McCain was really angry at George Bush for this, really angry. And for the longest time, he held a lot of animosity towards him. In the 2000 presidential election, and then when he ran in 2008, he was never really. He supported like George Bush's actions in Iraq, but he didn't really want to be seen with him. And for a lot of reasons. I mean, but this is a big one. There's internet polls. You got to be careful that internet polls are just simply a lot less reliable. Let me tell you why. Only people who have an interest will participate in internet polls. So if only interested people are participating in internet polls, are they really representing the true population? The answer is probably not. They just represent those who are interested. Which those who are interested are those political elites, or if you remember from Chapter 7, those passionates. They're not involving the uninformed or the scorekeepers. So if you remember that from Chapter 7. So there's if these passionates are the only ones getting involved in internet polls, and they are going to be biased in a particular way. And finally, another item to consider are mobile phones. Look, mobile phones make younger Americans a lot harder to reach. But, so why doesn't surveys just start using, calling mobile phones? Because it's expensive and it costs people minutes. Now, a lot of people have minute plans now that, are including either unlimited minutes or minutes. They have so many minutes that they're okay with it. But, look, you're still paying for these. Whereas with a landline, that's not the case. So, mobile phones make it a lot harder for Americans, for younger Americans to be reached by survey organizations. This means they're less polled, which makes the survey less reliable. Now, this is another survey here. They've got, but I'm telling you all the issues that we have with surveys, and there are, and I'll show you some more in the next slide. But, survey companies are doing a really good job of trying to survey not only Americans, but people around the world. And so this is a very interesting graph. It shows here the top global threats of polling around the world. And, the U.S. has a different opinion in regards to what it considers a threat in comparison to other regions of the world. So, for example, a big majority of Americans believe that North Korea's nuclear program is a major threat. But if you were to poll people in the Middle East or Latin America, their answer is no, it really isn't. The U.S., about 23% of Americans think that U.S. power and influence can be a threat to their country, whereas 42% of Asians believe that. And so you see differences. In terms of global climate change, only 40% of Americans believe it's a threat, whereas 56% of Asians and 65% of Latin Americans believe it. So there's a real difference in terms of polling around the world. So they've done a really good job of standardizing polling and asking questions in different languages that then we can compare properly. So, survey companies are doing a pretty good job. Now, one of the things that they do is when they report a survey, you'll always see that a survey has what we call a margin of error or a sampling error. It's the same thing. This is a statistical calculation for how accurate your results are. Now, again, remember, unless every person in the population of interest is surveyed, there will be survey errors. The survey's margin of error is its degree of inaccuracy, arising from the fact that the survey involves a sample. The survey involves a sample of the respondents from the population rather than every member. You're not going to interview or survey every member. You have to get a sample. Now, as a general rule, the larger the sample size, the more people you interview per se, the smaller the margin of error, which makes sense. You do reach a sweet spot around 1,500. Around 1,500, if you do the sampling right, you'll have a plus or minus of around 3%, and I'll explain what that means in a second. You'll have a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. Once you start getting a plus or minus of 7 or 8%, you really have to be careful whether or not you trust that poll. Now, if the change of the public opinion is within the poll's margin of error, it may not reflect any real rise or fall in public opinion. I'll explain that in the next slide. In other words, if we're asking somebody a question and it falls within the margin of error, then we can't say for certainty that it is. And pollsters must also realize what we call response bias. Sometimes what happens is we ask questions of people and they're not going to answer the way we want them to because they may be embarrassed. One of the things for example, one of the best examples they have is when Tom Bradley the first African-American mayor of Los Angeles, was running for governor against a white candidate, George Duke Majan, back in 1982 here in California. He had a comfortable double-digit lead, and he was all the way into the last day. He was up by at least 10 points, and then he lost the election. And everyone's like, what happened? Our surveys were scientific. They sampled right. It turned out to be that many white respondents didn't want to say that they didn't want to, that they were not, they didn't want to say that they didn't want to vote for Bradley because he was black. And so we now call this the Bradley effect, where it's the apparent inclination of some survey respondents to avoid appearing racist or racially motivated. And this happens a lot with white respondents when it comes to an African-American candidate, less so with a Latino or Asian. But they'll say, oh yeah, I would feel comfortable voting for this, but in reality they wouldn't. And so this is something that you see, this Bradley effect. It has been contested. Not everybody agrees with this, but this is a theory that's out there. So in this slide, I want you to understand how the margin of error works. So if you look here, the percentages in blue are within the results margin of error. And if you see here that there's 1,600 responses and a plus or minus 2.5 margin of error at a 95% confidence level. What does that mean, 95% confidence level? That means the chances are 95 in 100 that the population's percentage actually falls within the higher and lower numbers for each score reported. In other words, I'm 95% sure that it's going to fall within these ranges. So what are these ranges that I'm talking about? If you look at A, the A is preferred at 54%, where B is preferred at 44%. If it's plus or minus 2.5, basically means you're going down 2 in each direction. So if it's 54 here, and I'm going to circle the 54, we minus 2 to 52 and plus 2 to 56. That means 52 to 56. That's our range. 52 is our lower bound. 56 is our upper bound. Then we go and do this for B. Here's 44 in the middle. We do plus or minus 2. I'm just rounding it to 2. So we go minus 2 to 42, and then plus 2 to 46. So our lower bound is 42. Our upper bound is 46. Notice here there is a gap. That means that the lower bound, 52, is still higher than the upper bound of 46. That means that we can clearly say with conviction that A is clearly preferred. A is preferred over B because the ranges, the upper and the lower bound, don't actually cross each other. That is not the case in the next one. Look at this one, 400 responses, plus or minus 5% margin of error. And now what happens, remember, the less people we survey, the higher the margin of error. And what you see here is there's an overlap. When we plus or minus 5 from 54, that gives us a lower bound of 48 and an upper bound of 60. For 44, that gives us an upper bound of 50 and a lower bound of 38. I'm going to draw a box around this 48, 50. There is overlap. So we can say that A is probably preferred, but we cannot say it with any certainty. We can't say we're 100% this is it. Whereas in the previous one, if you look up here, notice with only a 2.5% margin of error, we could clearly say there's a gap between the lower bound and the upper bound. Therefore, we can say with confidence that A is preferred. Whereas in this one, we can't say that actually, because 48 and 50 overlap. So what happens is the lower bound, overlaps, well, excuse me, the lower bound of 54 overlaps with the upper bound of 44. That's that 48, 50 that I'm looking at. And so we could say it's probably preferred, but we can't say with certainty. Now then look at the next one. We only had about 100 responses. We have a 10% plus or minus margin of error. And then look at the overlap here. Look at this. The lower bound is 44, right? And the upper bound for B is 54. We have literally 10 percentage points overlap, which tells us that we cannot say with anything. We can't even say that A is preferred. We can say it's likely preferred, but honestly it could be equal, or B could even be preferred. We probably say that A is more likely preferred, but we can't say it with any confidence. So I just want you to see how sampling error works. The lower the sample size, the more likely you are to see a higher margin of error, because the sample size matters, You know, I won't get into this, but weighting matters, framing effects, margin, all these should be considered in a survey. So when you're getting into this, next thing is we look at types of polls. So, you know, this is something that you'll read here in the book, but a benchmark poll is conducted, this will just introduce you to some of the different polls that exist. A benchmark poll is conducted by a campaign as the race begins. These surveys provide a basis for comparison, right, almost as a benchmark for later polls. Either we've gone up, when they say, hey, we've gone up and down in the polls, they have to start somewhere. That starting poll is their benchmark poll. Then we have straw polls. These are informal polls carried out by local party organizations. They're often not scientific. A straw poll is like passing out a sheet of paper at a meeting and everybody pick one person. Well, okay, that might be just that organization at that time. So they're important because they kind of show, you know, which political candidate the group favored, but it's not scientific in any sense. Brushfire polls are these internal surveys that are conducted by a campaign once an election season begins. So what happens is every candidate, be it a presidential candidate or a congressional candidate, has a firm or somebody that does a survey for them to show sort of how they're doing. And then exit polls are performed on election day, both by campaigns and by news organizations. These surveys intercept voters as they exit the voting location, and this is how oftentimes they can project. If you notice, they can project California is going to go this way, or Florida will go this way, because they poll the people exiting polls. They survey people exiting polls, and they ask them how they're thinking, and then they translate that. And they're actually pretty accurate. Believe it or not, they've been off a couple times, but they're mostly pretty accurate when it comes to this stuff. All right, some of the top 5 tips then. When you're seeing a survey in a newspaper, seeing a survey online, here are the top 5 tips I want you to consider. First, check out the margin of error. Look what the margin of error is. If they don't have a margin of error, be careful. Because many times if they don't have a margin of error, it's because it's not a very scientific. Every scientific poll will report a margin of error. Now, once you do have a margin of error, I want you to make sure that it's not a margin of error where the approval rating or the margin of error is sky high. A typical margin of error is about 3%. That means plus or minus 3%, which turns a 50% approval rating into one of 47 to 53%. Keep that in mind. If it's 10, you know, plus or minus 10% for a margin of error, it's too big. Be careful of the larger percentages. Number 2, what is the timing? So, and when you look at a survey farther away from election day, the less meaningful the results. So keep in mind that whoever's leading in a particular election year may not be the one that's winning at the end. Third, the random sample is the gold standard. Remember now, if respondents could choose themselves by deciding to take the survey, it may be fun to read, but it's probably not an accurate picture of the public. This is a problem with internet polls. They tend to be those who either use the internet or those who are interested. And so you got to be careful with self-interested people. You want to get to more than just that. Number 4, what is the sample size? Be wary of polls that interview only a small number of people, like 100 people. Then that might be a good starting point, but you can't have what we call any inferences off of that. And then 5, compare cross polls. Since every poll has biases, when you read a range of polls, you could toss out the extreme findings and maybe take an average of the rest, and that'll give you a better reading of what's going on. That's why there's so many polls that are done, because of this. All right, let's look at this. Do opinions surveys influence us? That is a very interesting question, because sometimes polls do influence people, especially when people want to side with the majority. So one of the things that happens is what we call the bandwagon effect. The bandwagon effect is when people perceive everyone to be doing something and thus are moved to join in. So how does this work? Well, if there's a candidate running in a primary who's leading in the polls, he tends to pick up support from those who are undecided because he's leading in the polls. In other words, people want to jump on the bandwagon. They want to all of a sudden be with the winning team or be with the winning candidacy. So this candidate might pick up votes along the way simply because he or she is winning. And that may or may not translate to votes at the end. Most often it doesn't, surprisingly. You'd be shocked at that people leading in the polls on primaries, for let's say presidential primaries, we'll get to what a primary is in the next few chapters, they are not necessarily the ones who are going to win the election. You'd be surprised. There's also the boomerang effect. The boomerang effect is the discrepancy between a candidate's high poll ratings and election performance. This is usually caused by an assumption by the candidate supporters that they're going to have an easy win, therefore they don't need to turn out. So this is what happens when a candidate who's consistently ahead actually loses an election because the people who are supporting him are saying, well, he's going to win anyway, so why bother showing up? That's called the boomerang effect. So that can happen. And then the underdog effect is the opposite of the bandwagon effect. This is when a candidate who's often losing in the polls actually performs better than expected in the election, primarily because of they underestimated his or her popularity. So the next thing we look at then is finally public opinion in a democracy. How does public opinion actually look in a democracy? Well, there's two ongoing perspectives about this. The two ways that we have it is what we call the ignorant masses, and the other one we have is called the rational public. And so is the public rational, capable of self-government? Or are we just ignorant masses? I'll tell you what the founders thought. The founders were very wary of public opinion of the masses. There are intentional checks and balances built into the system to prevent mob rule. Originally, for example, like the Senate not being elected by the people directly, the president being indirectly elected through the Electoral College, lots of checks and balances that the founders thought we needed. Now let me read to you something James Madison said, a founding father and fourth president of the United States, that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether of one or a few or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. In other words, what he said is that if we have a government where one person or one group can consolidate all the power, that could lead to tyranny. Therefore, you need to separate the powers. If you look at a previous chapter, we not only talked about how powers are separated in the federal government between a legislative branch, Congress, an executive branch, the president, and a judicial branch, the Supreme Court, but it's also separated between the federal government and the 50 state governments. So power is really diffused within the United States. We have what we call a weak central government in comparison to other countries that have unitary or strong government, central governments. Now, it's not that our central government, our federal government, is a weak government. It's just in comparison, it doesn't have as many powers as others. And so another thing here that Thomas Jefferson said about democracy is a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49%. So the founders were worried about too much power, having public influence too much lawmakers. That the lawmakers should have some what we call the lawmakers should be insulated, a little bit, so that way they're making decisions, more of in a trustee style rather than a delegate style, to use words from a previous chapter. All right, so let's look at the first argument. Walter Lippmann, who is a very famous political scientist, wrote a book called Public Opinion. And he starts off the book by saying, well, the masses are asses. That's frankly what he said. And he said that, look, he described America as saying, look, most people are not very interested in public affairs. Most Americans have no expertise in political matters. And the public can decide only who governs at a given moment, and not much more. So he described America as an ignorant democracy. He argued that public opinion is a tool for manipulation and that the American public opinion is meaningless. That's what he said. This is a pretty damning assessment of people's opinions. And some of you might agree with Walter Lippmann. There was a publication of a book called The American Voter in 1960 by a series of political scientists who showed that Americans actually knew little about the positions either political party had or about the main policy issues at the time. And the authors of this book, they also developed what was known as the concept of non-attitudes. So non-attitudes are the lack of stable perspective in response to opinion surveys. In other words, answers to questions may become self-contradictory or display no ideological consistency. There's different answers to same questions when asked at different times, and the answers change randomly, which means if we have consistent public opinion, these authors say, then why do we keep changing the way we respond to things when asked at different times? And so this was an argument saying that we are ignorant, and that as ignorant public, lawmakers shouldn't really pay attention to what we're saying because, if we don't know what we're talking about, then they are the ones who are elected. They're the ones who should be making decisions. Again, that trustee model of representation. we trust them to make a decision, and they shouldn't trust us because we don't know what we're talking about. The alternative to that is the rational public argument, that we are a wise and a rational public. And it was actually a book called The Rational Public, written in response to the American voter. And it made 3 strong propositions. First, collective opinion is the key to assessing popular preferences. Well, who cares if we may shift our opinions or we answer wrong? It's taking it in the aggregate. You know, public opinion, they argued, the whole public moves in coherent, stable ways and not just in random non-attitudes. Second, individuals might be vague on policy specifics or even government basics. They argue that most people use what we call information shortcuts or heuristics to arrive at reasonable judgments about politics and government. These information shortcuts excuse me, are cues about candidates and policies drawn from everyday life, party preferences, and significant figures like friends, family, and trusted leaders. Most people use these to form basic political opinions. The next one is that collective opinion is useful only when public officials are attentive to it. Now, sometimes this connection is not clear because elites are responding to organized interest groups rather than the general public. But the broad conclusion of this book is that the collective public has rational views and that all the government should pay closer attention to them. And so we can arrive at reasonably well-established positions on candidates or public policy issues, and the government needs to pay attention to this. And according to the book, The Wisdom of Crowds, even if an individual does not have clear views, a large crowd taken together adds up, they argue, to a rational public. Now, one downfall of this is what we call groupthink. Groupthink is the tendency among the small group of decision makers to converge on a shared set of views. Groupthink can limit creative thinking or solutions to policy problems. Groupthink occurs when elites kind of give us the cues on how we should think, and then we use those cues and we don't question them. And so, yes, the public can be rational, and yes, the public can take their information shortcuts, their cues from other people, but at some point that can be a problem. So, yes, we are rational public, but there are some issues with it. But it's not big enough, the author, some of these folks say, to discard it completely. You can't discard public opinion just because you think it's irrational. It could be at times irrational, but in the long run, it is rational. And so that's something that to keep in mind. All right, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here so you have a little bit more understanding. This right here is popular attitudes towards abortion. And I want you to notice something here. They have been remarkably stable over the past 40 years. They have not shifted. And so, you know, look, if you see here, this top line here, this is the percent giving a pro-choice response. And the answer was if a woman's health is seriously endangered, and over 90% of Americans consistently say yes, they should have the choice to have an abortion. If you look then, strong chance of serious defect, right, or pregnant as a result of rape, you see anywhere between, you know, 75 to 85%. So a large majority of Americans register support for choice. However, if you look at it from another perspective, you see that if they're low income, can't afford more children, not married, or married and wants no more children, then Americans are less supportive of abortion as a choice. So what do we see from this? That the American public opinion is coherent. It's rational. Basically, the American people are saying, we're not a fan of abortion if you're using it for birth control or because you can't afford kids. We allow abortion in instances where the women don't have control, or in the case of rape or health or serious defect. So the American people have this pretty consistent opinion about abortion. This can explain why abortion has never been fully outlawed. So for those of you who are pro-life listening to this lecture and you're wondering why is it that we've never outlawed abortion, it's because large majorities of Americans register favorability to keeping abortion legal for instances like this. What Americans tend to not like is using abortion as a form of birth control. That's what they don't like. They think of this, you know, and you notice that the rates have actually gone down over time. They don't agree with this. So you can, if you're pro-choice, you probably argue that it should be open regardless, right, of whether or not it's by circumstance or through choice. If you're pro-life, you may not want it available even if it is by circumstance or choice. This is how the American people think. It is a pretty moderate position, and it's coherent in that it's lasted over the 40 years. In other words, it hasn't really changed. And that's interesting how that works. That's why, to me, it may not matter much if there's a pro-life or pro-choice president. Let me tell you why. Because they're not going to, if this is the American public opinion, and they go against what the American public opinion wants, they're going to run into trouble. So public opinion does matter. Presidents are unlikely to rock the boat. Now, they may say I'm pro-life or pro-choice because that'll help them get votes from pro-life or pro-choice votes, but they're unlikely to push that agenda because they know that the public has a particular view when it comes to a very controversial subject like abortion. So I just wanted to show you here how even in a very controversial subject, Americans have remarkably consistent views, and you can make a coherent public opinion out of this, which I just did by looking at these graphs. And the surveys support me when it comes to this. All right, let's look at the last part of the lecture, public opinion and governing. For public opinion to guide government, 3 conditions need to be met. First, the people need to know what they want, and that can help guide government decisions. 2, the public can clearly communicate its desires to political leaders. And 3, political leaders actually pay attention to public views and respond. So, do the people know what they want? Look, in a general way, the answer is yes. But political leaders have to often supply the policy specific. You know, public views are rarely concrete enough to offer a guide for policymakers. And this image I have here kind of gives an example. This is right at the height of the Great Recession when the banks were failing. And the banks failed because they made bad business deals. And the banks didn't have enough capital support, a lot of issues, and people turned against the banks. So before the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, people generally had a favorable view of our financial system, of the stock market and banks. After the Great Recession, Americans now have very negative views. And so from the right, you have people in the Tea Party who say these big banks should be allowed to fail. Why are governments supporting them? And from the left, you have, from Occupy Wall Street, you have people saying these people who took these banks into the ground should be punished or maybe even thrown in jail. So even the right and the left, they both agree we don't like what we saw with the Great Recession and the collapse of our banking system. But the question is, what do you do about it? So you have agreement on both sides for the most part. Hey, you know what? We know we don't like what we see. And so arguably we can say there's a coherent public opinion. But what are the specifics? And this is where we diverge, even if we even know what the specifics should be. And so many times we as Americans don't know enough about the financial system in order to provide specifics. So this is the hard part sometimes. Do the people know what they want? The answer is yes, but a lot of times we don't know specifically how to articulate what we want. Yes, we don't like that big banks failed, and we don't want that to happen again. The question is, how do we keep it from happening again? And that's a hard question to ask. The Obama administration and Democrats in Congress passed the Frank-Dodd Act of 2010, which provides regulations to prevent this from happening again. They may be right, they may be wrong. Some people like this, some people don't. I mean, it'll really sort of, it really depends. I guess if you tend to be a supporter of Barack Obama, you'll support this. If you're not a supporter of Barack Obama, then you won't support this. It generally now becomes more partisan. We go back to a previous part of the lecture, we talked about partisan cues. This is where your party can help maybe guide you on how do you think in regards to an issue like the banking system collapse of 2009 and how you should, 2008, 2009 I should say, and how you should view it. All right. How do people communicate their desires? Well, look, it's difficult for the people, even clear majorities, to convey their views to policymakers at times. So this is often what happens is when a candidate wins, and it wins a large majority, they often have what we call a mandate. A mandate is a political authority claimed by an election winner as reflecting the approval of the people. Classic idea of a mandate is 2012 presidential election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney said, we're going to make this an election about the Affordable Care Act, also known as about Obamacare. Barack Obama said, bring it on, we will. And because Barack Obama was reelected, he said, I feel vindicated about Obamacare, and this is a mandate to continue with this act. Flat out. So we often say elections have consequences. And so he felt that he had a mandate to continue on, and that's why he will not bend when it comes to Obamacare. Republicans want him to tweak this, tweak that. He's like, no. He's like, I ran on this, I implemented it, and I won on this. Therefore, why should I have to bend? That's the concept of a mandate. So just to give you an idea of what we mean by this. Interest groups and political parties also transmit popular views. So interest groups, political parties also try to explain sort of what maybe the people are thinking. That's another way people communicate their desires. And often, as we just talked about this entire lecture, survey research. And if survey research is, remember, survey research is a systematic study of a defined population, analyzing a representative sample's view to draw inferences, or we want to draw a larger opinion about the larger public's views. An inference is when we try to take a small group and try to understand the larger group's opinion from the small group. We infer. So again, this research has a margin of error for each study, which allows studies to be seen as being scientific. So that's really important. Look at your margin of error. Look at with sampling. If you don't trust a survey, maybe because you just understand surveys. Hopefully, with this lecture, you've understood a little bit more about surveys, which gives you a chance to be more confident in the surveys that you're reading. All right. Last, do leaders respond to public opinion? Look, it seems like the answer is yes. It seems like public policy often correlates with public opinion. One way to understand public opinion and if it correlates is that of approval ratings. Approval ratings are the way we measure public support for a political figure or institution. For example, the classic approval rating is, do you approve of the way the president is doing his job? That's a very classic presidential approval question. Now, leaders can go against public opinion if other institutions will not act on the issue. For example, you see that President Barack Obama issued an executive action limiting the deportation of what's called dreamers. The dreamers are those who are here undocumented, but came over between the ages of, let's say, 5 and 20. In fact, they're the ones who came over usually with their parents without realizing they're undocumented. Why do I bring this up? President Obama is arguing today and saying, I'm going to go against public opinion, and I'm acting on this issue because Congress has now decided what they want to do with these folks. And so most Americans, as survey shows, say he shouldn't do this. But he argued, no, I have to because Congress is not doing its job. And Congress was not happy with the fact that he did this. But we'll get into this executive order, executive action stuff later on. We'll talk about the presidency. Look, polls clearly matter in setting the agenda, and shaping topics governing officials pay attention to. The agenda is issues that the public considers important. The media covers what the politicians discuss. Setting the agenda is sort of the first step in political action, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter. Government also regulates media through protecting and ensuring competition among media outlets, so we just don't have one media channel, we have a competition. And there are not proven ideological biases in the reporting information. So even though, although most reporters identify as Democrat, there are other biases that are actually more important than partisan. For example, racing to the news first, stories that sell and encourage ratings, and stories that aren't really newsworthy, but they're included. For example, CNN now, and we'll talk about this next chapter, CNN on its webpage now will have a selfie of the week. What does that have to do with the news? And it doesn't. So, yes, people talk about how reporters are liberal, and they're right, they are liberal, but there might be more important biases than just that are going on with the media. And we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. And finally, spikes in public opinion have an effect on institutions, especially Congress. Members of Congress are often reluctant to legislate in the face of strong popular opposition. And in the end, public opinion can also enable presidential actions. I remember I was talking to you earlier about support for ISIS. Let's look at this now. Then and now, support for military action in Syria. We are opposed to military action in Syria, which is a country in the Middle East that's been engulfed by civil war. But we are also in favor, we support military action in Syria against ISIS militants. And so we're not in favor of getting involved in Syria, but with now all the atrocities committed by ISIS and everything that's been going on in this organization, we now support military action in Syria. So this may enable President Obama or the next president to do something about what's going on there in Syria. All right, so conclusion, government by the people. Self-rule appears to demand that the public opinion guide or at least influence the government. Public opinion surveys are the most widely used effort to understand the popular mind. However, public opinion often seems ill-founded, whimsical, or uninformed. So good policy must rely on experts and political leaders as well. Now, others respond that the public must rule, given our foundational commitment to democratic politics in America. And so the question is, do we let the experts lead or do we let the public lead? You know what everyone agrees? We'd be better off if the public was better informed. In other words, if the public was better informed, then this wouldn't be an issue. We wouldn't worry about experts. We wouldn't worry about the public because the public would be better informed, which means they can check experts and we also trust their opinion more, which is why you're taking this class. The reason why you've been forced to basically take this class before you can finish any type of degree or certificate is because exactly this education and information that you can get. All right, so this concludes our lecture on Chapter 8 in the Maroney and Kirsch book by the People Debating American Government, Public Opinion.